How's it going, folks? I'm Kowalski. Welcome to Prairie Fire. So, for this episode, I wanted to talk a little bit about a previous video I had made on why farmers voted the way they did. It was a discussion that kind of talked about why rural areas are a little more susceptible to the type of propaganda that Republicans put out, and why I believe that led to them voting the way they did. Now, in the comments, I kept seeing a reoccurring theme that rural areas are not as educated as urban areas, so the people are not as intelligent, that they are more religious and therefore more susceptible to propaganda, and that they are just more racist, meaning they would vote against their own interests if it thought that it would keep other members of the population down. Now, I didn't really dwell on these, maybe that was a fault of my own, but I don't really find these arguments to be all that compelling, but to explain that, I wanted to talk about why it seems Democrats vote in their interest more often than Republicans. But to do that, I thought it would be a good idea to discuss a little bit about the 2016, the 2020, and then the 2024 election, just so that we're all on the same page. All right, so let's look back at the 2016 election. We are just now at the tail end of Obama's second term. So, in that election, what is the sentiment of the people? What are people asking and demanding for out of the next president? Basically, they want change. The reason people want change is because Obama was not exactly a good president. I would even argue he was probably a pretty bad president in general. My reasoning for that is ask yourself, what was Obama's biggest achievement as president? Clearly, it was the ACA. The ACA was a half measure to improve the healthcare system in the United States, and it did what it set out to do. It stopped the accelerated increase of healthcare costs and got rid of the pre-existing conditions that could get you thrown off of your health insurance due to no fault of your own. These were good steps. However, it was basically a means for the government to subsidize private health insurance companies, which was ultimately a bad idea because a private health insurance company spends money towards things that have nothing to do with healthcare. Medicare, for instance, only about 4 cents of every dollar put into that goes towards administrative costs. In the private healthcare system, they have a much larger bureaucracy, and it requires nearly 24 cents of every dollar put in to go towards non-healthcare related costs. So think of like bonus pay for boards of executives, think of just executive pay in general. Think about marketing and lobbying and all the lawyer fees, and then creating a massive bureaucracy to hold hospitals hostage in the way that they do their price negotiations. So it wasn't a good system. It was better than what we had, but it wasn't exactly a home run policy. So aside from getting Osama bin Laden, I can't really think of any other thing that the Obama administration did that we would view as a net positive. Some people would say, well, they stopped the 2008 financial crisis. Not really. They bailed out the banks. They didn't bail out the homeowners. So the people who caused the crisis, and it was the banks who caused it, they were the ones who had the loan officers, the people who were supposed to be the qualified individuals to tell you if you qualified for a loan or not. And basically, those guys got let off the hook. And then we went into quantitative easing, where the banks were given even more power, where they loaned out a lot of cash for basically nothing. And they predominantly loaned out that cash to corporations. This is how we ended up with the tech sector that we have today. And it's how we ended up with groups like BlackRock and other equity companies just buying up vast swaths of the American real estate sector, ultimately creating the high rent rates that we see right now. Basically, it was a short term, simple fix that created a whole host of long term problems. Another big issue the Obama administration created was basically wanting to run the entire party through the administration itself. So instead of entrusting the Democratic Party to manage its own interests each state, they wanted just one central authority. And in 2010, the Democrats ended up losing over 1,000 House seats in state houses nationwide. This absolutely crippled Democrats moving forward. Not only did they end up losing a bunch of states to Republican supermajorities, which were then able to entrench themselves, making it near impossible to break back into them, It also crippled the talent that would be able to move up in the Democratic Party. Imagine if we just like crippled all of NCAA sports in the US, then 10 years later, what do you think that would do to like the NFL or the NBA? You would basically just cripple your talent. It was a very short-sighted and arrogant approach, and it's pretty much completely on the Obama administration that that happened. Now, I know some of you are thinking, well, he did get a same sex marriage. No, that was actually the Supreme Court that pulled that off. And then, speaking of the Supreme Court, he failed to get older liberal judges to retire and for him to appoint their replacements. As a result of this catastrophic failure, they basically handed the Supreme Court over to the conservatives on a silver platter. This was extraordinarily short-sighted, and it has been a crippling aspect to the Democrats for basically the last 10 years. Okay, so that's where we are in 2016. We have a personally popular president who has basically done nothing to make the cost of living cheaper for Americans and whose one achievement was just a half measure. So, who are the main candidates going into 2016 for the Democratic Party? Well, you have Hillary Clinton, who is basically the person that the entire party has hand selected to be the next nominee. You then had this unknown senator from Vermont, Bernie Sanders, running on Medicare for All. He was basically playing the populist angle. He got into the race a little later than he probably should have if he was actually going to win. It seemed like his entire campaign was geared around one policy, and he messaged it pretty well. The other candidate was basically Martin O'Malley. There were a few other just mainstream Dems, but he was probably the biggest that wasn't Hillary Clinton. Unfortunately for Hillary Clinton, the Republicans knew that she was likely going to be the nominee and had been working for years to basically run her name through the dirt. There were several Benghazi hearings, no convictions, but an entire political machine was built to drag her name through the mud. She was probably capable of beating any Republican aside from a populist. And if you look on the Republican side during that election, there were a few mainstream Republicans and there was Donald Trump. The most prominent mainstream was probably Jeb Bush. All of those guys probably would have lost because they didn't offer anything new. Trump was different because he was a populist. He was pulling on a lot of emotions. It was something that I don't think the Dems were prepared for. But Hillary Clinton was probably the least qualified to take him on. Martin O'Malley would have won. Bernie Sanders would have won. They just didn't have that same historical baggage that Hillary Clinton had. So in 2016, Bernie Sanders did way better than he probably should have. His candidacy for the primary went all the way to the Democratic Convention, where he ultimately did concede to Hillary Clinton and then supported her. He campaigned for her. He asked his supporters to campaign for her. He did all he could to help get her elected. Unfortunately, Clinton, kind of arrogant, believed that it was basically a shoe-in victory, didn't really work much on a ground game. There wasn't any door knocking in, Michigan, Wisconsin, or Pennsylvania, the key swing states. And she ultimately lost. Kind of, hubris there. So then we ended up with the Trump administration. Love it. All right. Now let's fast forward to the 2020 election. At this point, December of 2019, Bernie Sanders is by and large the primary Democratic challenger going into the primary. The reason for that is he basically kept his political machine going from the 2016 election. As a result, he had the best ground game out of anybody. He was raising the most small dollar donations. He had a good finger on the pulse of what the main issues were. He had more surrogates out there communicating his message. And what was the thing Democrats were angry the most about in the 2020 election? This was prior to COVID. Basically, wealth inequality, the rising costs of health insurance, the seemingly out of control power that the wealthy were accumulating. So Bernie had built an entire campaign around addressing these issues. Wealth inequality was a big one. He was really big at saying we were going to tax the rich. We needed to make the system more fair. Of course, he was still touching on healthcare. He was also touching on the Green New Deal. This was going to be a massive jobs program that was going to help increase our infrastructure spending, which we need to do, as well as a means to boost wages. All of this basically fundamentally follows every pragmatic economic analysis you could think of. It was a good, thought out, well rounded campaign. So the 2020 Democratic primary was quite the crowded field. There were like 16 declared candidates, and only two of them would be considered more of your like populist candidates. That would have been Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Everybody else is competing for like the entrenched establishment corporate wing of the party. Those groups would eventually consolidate around one candidate, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So the Iowa caucus comes around, and Bernie Sanders basically wins. He won the first round of voting, but there's an issue with the voting machines, and it's declared that another candidate actually won. Was this the case? Probably not, but Iowa is considered a wash for Bernie. Then we go to New Hampshire, and in New Hampshire, Bernie just flat out wins. But then we start hearing an interesting narrative come about. New Hampshire doesn't matter, Iowa doesn't matter, and Nevada will probably not matter. What really matters, what's the actual bellwether, is South Carolina for some reason. Interesting. We'll get back to that in a second. So then we get over to Nevada, and Bernie once again just flat out wins. He's got the momentum behind him. Young people are energized for him. He is who the people want. He is talking about the issues, and people are genuinely excited for this. And then South Carolina. So South Carolina is where the establishment Democrats decided to make their stand. This is where they started pulling out all the stops. There was Obama down there campaigning on behalf of Biden. They pulled out Clyburn, who was a regionally very popular politician down there with a lot of sway. They outspent everybody on advertisements, and they ended up pulling out a victory there. After South Carolina came Super Tuesday, and just prior to that, basically every candidate, with the exception of Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, dropped out and endorsed Joe Biden, consolidating everybody else around Joe Biden. The interesting thing is, almost every single one of those people that dropped out either got a cabinet position or key parts of the legislation they were advocating for thrown into Biden's future agenda. And it's interesting, the one candidate who did not drop out of the race was Elizabeth Warren, who basically is going to be the person competing the most with Bernie Sanders' votes. So she was never going to be pulling votes away from the establishment. She was only ever going to be pulling votes away from Bernie, and she would end up being able to pass a lot of her policy agendas in the Biden administration. So clearly, everybody is organizing behind Biden to get Bernie out of the race. So at this point in 2020, it is a race between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. So let's talk a little bit about their position on a lot of issues and see which one was going to be the better candidate. It's pretty obvious when it comes to healthcare. Joe Biden's big deal was he wanted to increase the subsidies going to the Affordable Care Act in order to make it less expensive for the users. This would mean just enriching private corporations more with our tax dollars. Not exactly the most popular approach. Bernie, Medicare for all, cut the middleman out, be able to do more bargaining to get prescription drug prices down. So, in this instance, healthcare for the working class American, it is undoubtedly Bernie is the better option. Where did these two candidates stand on race relations? Well, Joe Biden got called out in one of the debates by his future vice president for not supporting busing. Busing was a strategy used at the end of desegregation in order to basically mix the races of kids in different schools, whole thing. He was against it because, he thought it would create too much chaos. And where did Bernie stand on these types of racial issues? He got arrested fighting for civil rights. So when it comes to race relations, your better pick would have been Bernie. Another thing people were getting tired of around that time and to this very day is the number of wars America gets into. Now, there basically has not been a war where Bernie Sanders has not, vocally been against, but there has never been a war that Biden hasn't just openly supported. You got to remember, he did sign off on the Iraq War and all the war powers that came along with that, which ultimately led to the drone war, which kind of shattered U.S. credibility all over the planet. So the anti war candidate between these two was once again Bernie Sanders. I would also like to point out around this time, Bernie Sanders is also quite popular amongst Republicans, not necessarily for his policies, but because he seems like a genuine human being. That is one thing that Republicans seem to always respect Bernie with is the fact that he sticks to his guns, he believes what he believes, and he never changes or folds that position ever. All right, so at this point in the 2020 campaign, it is just prior to Super Tuesday. At this point, Biden is getting a lot of momentum behind him. A lot of the other campaigns are all shutting down and endorsing him. He is also now flush with cash, and he is hitting the advertisements like no one else could have at that point. Um, Bernie still has a really good ground game going, but since the New Hampshire primary, a narrative had been floating around in the mainstream press that Bernie is unelectable. He's a really nice guy. We like Bernie, but in this moment, we need a known, stable hand to guide the ship, and that is clearly Biden. And this had been basically stated for weeks by everyone. Every single mainstream news media outlet was saying this over and over and over. So after Super Tuesday, Bernie did not get a commanding victory. He did well, but it wasn't enough to, keep the momentum rolling. And worse for him, the only other candidate staying in the race aside from Biden was Warren, who was siphoning off votes from Bernie. This basically split the outsider coalition, ensuring that the establishment candidate was almost certain to win. Now, some of you are probably figuring out where I'm going with this, but for the rest of you, you're probably thinking this is a decent history lesson, but what does this have to do with rural people, foolishly voting against their own interests? What I just described to you in that history lesson is Democrats constantly voting against their own interests. Remember, in the 2020 election, Democrats wanted a change candidate, which was Bernie, and they voted for Biden, who was promising that nothing would fundamentally change or it would go back to normal. When it came to wanting an anti war candidate, the Democrats voted for the guy who authorized the Iraq War and gave the president more power to wage war unilaterally. When it came to addressing wealth inequality, they voted for the guy who wanted to just basically nibble around the edges, as opposed to Bernie, who wanted to tax the rich and openly said we were going to tax the rich, not just as a means to pay for social programs, but to just create a more equitable society. So I guess my question for you is why do Democrats always seem to vote against their best interest? Because around December of 2019, Bernie was the candidate that was in the lead. He was the one talking about all of the issues. He was popular amongst Democrats and even had begrudging respect from Republicans. And yet, in just what? An 8-week marketing campaign? All of those Democrats were just tricked into voting against their own economic and social interests? Yeah, basically they were. It is pretty awful how easily we are manipulated by the media. I mean, you might say that, oh, rural people are less educated, but I feel like it's almost worse going up to a more educated Democrat, patting them on the head, saying, "You're so smart. You watch John Oliver. Therefore, you are a very smart person. By the way, voting for Joe Biden is just a logical conclusion when we're dealing with a figure like Trump. Never mind the fact that Joe Biden is promising to bring back, the normalcy of the Obama years, which led to Trump in the first place. But hey, you're smart. You watch the right people, you listen to the right news. Brilliant. I do not say those things to mock Democrats or to mock people who live in urban areas. Voting against your own interest is literally the point of propaganda. It's why it exists. And to believe that you are not susceptible to propaganda means the propaganda is working quite well. You have to be constantly vigilant on this. This is why it is very important to build political institutions fighting on behalf of what you believe is correct. This is why going after unions was such a fundamental thing for corporations to do for the last half of the 20th century. It's why corporations are politically ascendant. Their organizations and institutions have a lot of control over the media. Yes, it can be pierced by the outside, but maintaining and sustaining a clear narrative is very difficult without institutional support from something. And as of right now, both political parties are essentially captured by corporate interests who have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, do nothing. It's not too much of a shocker to see why Hillary Clinton lost in 2016 because, everybody remembered the Obama administration. Wasn't that great? But then just switch right over to 2020 and suddenly everybody remembers the Obama administration with rose-tinted glasses. Even though it was a colossal failure of an administration, people were all willing to vote to bring back the good old days. Fast forward to 2024, things aren't going well. Wealth inequality is increasing. Inflation is up. Things are getting more expensive. And now people look back on the first Trump administration with rose-tinted glasses, saying, wow, remember when things were affordable? I might not have liked the way he tweeted, but man, life was a lot easier back then. These things are just easy to manipulate. I mean, think about this. How many people are trying to rehabilitate George W. Bush right now? Oh, he had a few good speeches, and suddenly people think that he was like this dignified statesman? No. But this kind of goes to the greater point. It's very easy to manipulate the narrative when you have control over so much of the media, and both political parties do. There is no urban-rural divide. There is only one distinction that matters: the rich versus the rest of us. And if we continue to divide the rest of us, the rich will be able to defeat us in detail. Well, folks, I think that's it for now. I'm sure this is going to be an exciting comment section. Try to keep it respectful. But yeah, just remember we are all susceptible to propaganda, and the only way we can create a better world is through working class solidarity. So, with that, I will catch you on the next one. I'm sure it's not an ominous warning at all that it's late December in Nebraska and it is over 60 degrees out and the grass appears to be turning green. Nope, definitely fine. Nothing to worry about here.